Story 1: The Disappearance of Liora Vasquez. Liora Vasquez stood at the railing of the SS Meridian, the night breeze tugging at her dark curls as she gazed out at the endless Black Sea. It was her fourth night aboard the luxury cruise, and while the trip had promised relaxation, she felt an unease that had been creeping in since the first day. It wasn't just the vastness of the ocean or the eerie silence of the late hours. It was something else, a feeling of being watched. She glanced around the deck. The once lively area had quieted, with only a few scattered guests left sipping cocktails in the dimly lit lounge. Most had already retreated to their rooms, leaving the night to those who, like her, found it difficult to sleep. Then she saw him again. Dmitry Novak, tall, well-dressed, with sharp features and piercing gray eyes. He had caught her attention the first day they boarded. Not because he was particularly handsome, but because he always seemed to be nearby. The dining hall, the pool deck, the bar. Whenever she turned around, Dmitry wasn't far. And now, there he was again, watching her from across the deck. He approached with an effortless confidence, his movements smooth, deliberate. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, his voice smooth as silk. Liora hesitated before answering. "Guess not. The ocean does that to people," he said, stepping beside her. "Something about its vastness makes us feel small." She gave a polite nod, keeping her eyes on the water. She wasn't sure if she wanted company. Something about Dmitry felt off. Out of the corner of her eye, she noticed him watching her. Not in a casual way, more like an assessment. "You're traveling alone, aren't you?" he asked. Her muscles tensed. "How do you know that?" Dmitry smiled. "I saw you at dinner. No one ever joins you." She let out a small laugh, trying to mask her unease. "Maybe I like my own company," he chuckled, taking a step closer. "That's rare. Most people fear solitude." Liora forced herself to hold his gaze. There was something unsettling about his words, the way he spoke as if he knew her. "Well, I should probably head in," she said, turning toward the exit. Dmitry didn't move at first. Then, after a pause, he nodded. "Of course. Sleep well, Liora." Her breath hitched. "I never told you my name." A flicker of something passed through his eyes, gone too fast to read. Then, effortlessly, he said, "You told me at the bar the other night." She hadn't. She was sure of it. But instead of arguing, she forced a smile and walked away. The next morning, the SS Meridian was in an uproar. At first, it was just murmurs among the passengers. A missing guest. An unusual call from the captain over the intercom. But by noon, the whispers turned into fear. Liora Vasquez had vanished. Crew members searched her cabin. The bed was neatly made. Her suitcase was still there, untouched. The bathroom light was still on. There was no sign she had ever left voluntarily. Security footage from the ship's cameras should have helped. But something was wrong. Most of the footage from the upper deck, where she was last seen, was corrupted, distorted frames of static and blackness. Only one image remained. In the recovered frame, Liora stood by the railing, her expression frozen in sheer terror. And just behind her, barely visible in the shadows, was a second figure. Someone who did not match any registered passenger on board. The ship's security team questioned everyone who had seen Liora the previous night. Dmitry Novak was one of them. "I spoke with her briefly," he said smoothly. "She seemed distracted. Said she was tired and went back to her room." The officers studied him. "And you didn't see her after that?" Dmitry shook his head. "No." Liora's cabin was on the same deck as his, but no one had seen her return. The ship's captain, Hensley Moore, had been with the SS Meridian for over 2 decades. He had seen accidents at sea. He had seen people fall overboard. But something about this case unsettled him. If she went overboard, he told his officers, there would have been a sound, a splash. Someone would have heard it, but no one had. The ship's crew conducted a thorough search. Every deck, every lifeboat, every storage compartment. Nothing. Then, one of the crew members found something strange near the railing where Liora was last seen. A small silver locket lying on the floor. When the captain opened it, he felt the hair on his arms rise. Inside was a black and white photograph. A woman who looked exactly like Liora. The photo was old, its edges yellowed with time. And on the back, scrawled in ink, was a name. The SS Meridian continued its voyage. With no evidence of foul play, the ship's official report listed Liora's disappearance as an unexplained event. Passengers whispered about it for the rest of the trip. Some believed she had fallen overboard. Others were convinced she had run away. But those who had been on the cruise before knew better. Over the years, stories had circulated about the ship. Tales of passengers who had vanished without a trace. Some claimed it was the sea, taking its own sacrifices. Others whispered about the woman in the old photographs, women who looked eerily similar to the missing. When the SS Meridian finally docked at its final destination, Dmitry Novak was one of the first to leave. He stepped onto solid ground, adjusting the cuffs of his blazer. In his pocket, he felt the cool metal of the silver locket he had slipped from the railing before anyone noticed. Slowly, he opened it, staring at the faded photo inside. Leora's face stared back at him. Only now, beneath her name, another word had appeared. A word that had not been there before. Returned. And somewhere, in the vast and endless sea, the SS Meridian sailed on, waiting for its next passenger. Story 2: The Phantom Passenger, Jonas Calloway's Encounter. The SS Oceania was supposed to be a fresh start. Jonas Calloway had booked the week-long cruise on a whim, desperate for a break from his exhausting life as a journalist. He had spent the past few years chasing crime stories, corruption, and scandals, and it had left him burnt out. A cruise to Hawaii, surrounded by nothing but open sea and fresh air, seemed like the perfect escape. At least that's what he thought. By the third night, something felt off. He couldn't explain it at first. It wasn't the usual unease that came with being in the middle of the ocean. It was something deeper, something that gnawed at his gut. It started with the cabin door. Jonas had always been meticulous. He double-checked locks, made sure things were in their proper place. But the past 2 nights, he'd woken up to find his cabin door unlocked. The first time, he brushed it off. Maybe he had forgotten. Maybe he had been too tired. The second time, he was sure he had locked it. And then, there were the whispers. They came at odd hours, just as he was drifting off to sleep. Soft, indecipherable murmurs, like someone speaking just outside his door. But every time he got up to check, the hallway was empty. By the third night, he barely slept. At around 2 a.m., he gave up trying and sat by the window, watching the ocean stretch endlessly beneath the moonlight. The ship swayed gently, a rhythmic motion that should have been soothing. But then, something moved in his peripheral vision. He turned sharply, heart pounding. A woman stood at the far end of his cabin. She was dressed in an old-fashioned white gown, her long black hair cascading down her back. Her face was pale, too pale, and her eyes were dark voids that swallowed the dim light of the cabin. Jonas froze, his breath hitched in his throat. She didn't speak. She only stared. Then, in a whispery voice that sent chills down his spine, she said, "He never let me leave." Jonas lunged for the light switch. When the room flooded with brightness, she was gone. His chest heaved. His palms were clammy. Every rational part of his brain screamed that it had been a hallucination. Lack of sleep, stress, anything but what he had just witnessed. But then, he noticed something. The closet door. It was slightly ajar, and he was certain it had been shut before. He approached it slowly, heart hammering. With a shaky breath, he pulled it open. Nothing. Just empty space. But as he exhaled in relief, his eyes landed on something near the bottom shelf. A small yellowed envelope, tucked into the corner. Frowning, he picked it up and unfolded the brittle paper inside. The letter was dated September 9th, 1953. "If anyone finds this, please tell my family I didn't just disappear. Tell them he wouldn't let me leave." At the bottom, there was a name, Aurelia Sinclair. Jonas felt the air in the room grow impossibly still. The woman in his cabin had whispered the same words. The next morning, Jonas sought out one of the crew members, a man named Raul de la Vega. He had spoken with him briefly the first day, and Raul seemed like the type who knew more about the ship than he let on. Jonas found him near the storage deck, finishing his morning duties. "You've been working on this ship a long time, haven't you?" Jonas asked, trying to sound casual. Raoul wiped his hands on a rag and nodded. 15 years. Jonas hesitated, then asked, "Do you know the name Aurelia Sinclair?" Raoul's face darkened instantly. He glanced around before pulling Jonas aside. "Where did you hear that name?" Jonas debated telling the truth, but his gut told him Raoul already knew more than he should. "I found a letter in my cabin," he admitted. "And last night, I saw something." Raoul exhaled sharply. "You need to switch rooms. Now." Jonas frowned. "What? Why?" Raoul lowered his voice. "Aurelia Sinclair was a passenger on this ship, well, a version of this ship. The SS Oceania has been rebuilt over the decades. But the original vessel? She disappeared from it in 1953. Jonas felt his skin prickle. Disappeared? Raoul nodded grimly. She was engaged to one of the ship's officers. People said he was possessive, jealous. She tried to leave him, but before the ship reached port, she vanished. No body, no evidence, nothing. Jonas clenched his jaw. "And you believe he killed her?" "I don't believe," Raoul murmured. "I know." Jonas swallowed. "So why is she still here?" Raoul's eyes darkened. "Because she never left." That night, Jonas tried to ignore the story. He tried to tell himself it was all superstition, an old ghost tale passed down among crew members. But deep down, he knew better. And at exactly 2 a.m., the whispers returned. This time, he didn't turn on the lights. He sat up in bed, pulse hammering, waiting. The air in the cabin grew colder. A shadow moved in the corner. Then she was there. Aurelia stood at the foot of his bed, her face more defined now, her dark eyes pleading. Jonas barely found his voice. "What do you want?" Her lips parted, and she whispered, "Help me." Jonas shuddered. "How?" Slowly, she raised one pale hand and pointed toward the closet. Jonas hesitated before climbing out of bed. His every step felt like walking through ice. He reached the closet, placed his hand on the knob, and the ship lurched. Jonas stumbled as the lights flickered. The walls groaned. The air itself seemed to bend. And in that split second, he understood. The closet wasn't a closet. It was a door, a hidden compartment, long sealed, long forgotten. Jonas gritted his teeth and pulled. The wooden panel gave way with a sickening crack, and behind it was a small, dark space. Inside, lying in the shadows, was a skeleton in a tattered white dress. The ship shuddered violently. The lights died. The whispering turned into a scream. Jonas staggered back, eyes wide as the air around him thickened, like the ship itself was gasping. And then Aurelia was gone. The cabin fell silent. The air warmed. Jonas collapsed into the chair, heart pounding. He didn't need Raoul to tell him what he had just found. Aurelia Sinclair had never left. But now she finally could. The next morning, when the ship docked in Hawaii, Jonas filed a report. The authorities would investigate, and soon the world would know the truth. But as he stood on solid ground, staring back at the SS Oceania, he couldn't shake the feeling that some ghosts never truly leave. And that night, as he unpacked his bag, he found something resting on top of his clothes. A small, yellowed envelope. Inside was a photo of Aurelia Sinclair. On the back, in faded ink, was one final message. "Thank you." Story 3: The Man in Cabin 604. The celestial dawn was a floating paradise. At least, that's what the brochures promised. For Vivian Calloway, a cruise had seemed like the perfect way to unwind after an exhausting year. She was a travel blogger, used to exploring new places, reviewing resorts, and finding hidden gems. This time, she wanted something simple. A week of cocktails, sunbathing, and maybe a little flirting with a handsome stranger. But something about this ship felt wrong. She noticed it on the second day. It wasn't anything obvious, just small, unsettling details, like how some hallways felt colder than others, how the staff seemed to avoid certain areas, how, at night, she would hear footsteps outside her cabin, only to find the hallway empty when she checked. And then there was cabin 604. It was 3 doors down from hers, on the starboard side. The first time she walked past it, she barely noticed it. But the second time, something caught her eye. The door had scratches on it. Not just regular wear and tear, deep, jagged scratches like someone had clawed at the wood. Curious, she asked one of the stewards about it. He paled instantly. "Don't worry about that room, Mississippi." Vivian frowned. "Why?" The steward hesitated, then muttered, "It's empty." That didn't make sense. Empty rooms didn't get scratches on their doors. That night, she stayed up later than usual, sipping a drink on her balcony, watching the moonlight ripple on the waves. The ocean was calm, but inside, she felt restless. And then she heard it, a thud, followed by a slow, dragging sound. It was coming from the hallway. Heart pounding, Vivian slipped out of her cabin, stepping barefoot onto the carpeted floor. The hallway was dim, illuminated only by small, flickering sconces. Then she saw it. The door to cabin 604 was open, just a crack. She swallowed, her pulse hammering. She knew she should turn back, go to bed, forget about it. But her curiosity was stronger. Slowly, she crept forward and peered inside. The room was pitch black. But then something moved in the darkness. A shadow. Vivian gasped and stumbled back. Her foot hit the wall, and in her panic, she knocked over a small decorative table. The noise was deafening in the quiet hallway. Her breathing was ragged as she turned and bolted back to her cabin, slamming the door shut behind her. She locked it, pressed her back against it, and forced herself to breathe. She didn't sleep that night. The next morning, she found the steward again. "I know that room isn't empty," she said. "What's going on?" The man hesitated, then let out a weary sigh. "Miss, you don't want to know." Vivian crossed her arms. "I do." The steward glanced around before lowering his voice. "Cabin 604 has a history." Vivian's skin prickled. "What kind of history?" He looked even more nervous. "A passenger died in that room. Years ago. A man named Henry Kessler. No one knows exactly what happened, but guests in the cabins nearby heard him screaming the night before they found him. When security broke in, the room was empty." Vivian's stomach tightened. "Empty?" The steward nodded. "No sign of him. No body. Just his belongings. And the scratches on the door." Vivian's mouth went dry. "They searched the whole ship," the steward continued. "Checked security footage. He was never seen leaving his cabin. He just vanished." A chill crawled down her spine. She wanted to brush it off. Call it a ghost story, an urban legend passed down by crew members. But she had seen something in that room. Something that was still there. That night, Vivian stayed in her cabin with the lights on. She tried to focus on her work, writing up a new blog post, editing photos from her trip. But then her lights flickered. She froze, her fingers hovering over her keyboard. The lights dimmed again, then buzzed back to full brightness. And then, from the hallway, a knock. Her breath caught in her throat. Another knock. And then a voice. Muffled. Deep. Not quite human. "Help me." Vivian's blood turned to ice. The voice was coming from outside her door. She clamped a hand over her mouth, forcing herself not to scream. Slowly, she moved toward the door, pressing her eye against the peephole. First, she saw nothing. Then a shadow shifted. A tall figure stood in the hallway. He was just out of focus, just blurry enough that she couldn't make out his face. But the way he stood, the way his head tilted unnaturally to one side, made her stomach churn. Then, with slow, deliberate movements, he turned toward her. Vivian stumbled back from the door. The knocking stopped. For several minutes, she stood there, shaking. And then her doorknob turned. The lock held, but the scratching started. Deep, scraping sounds against the wood. Slow at first, then faster, more desperate. Vivian backed away, heart hammering. Then silence. For what felt like forever, she didn't move. Then, cautiously, she approached the door again. She held her breath, pressed her eye against the peephole, and this time she saw a face. Or rather, the hollow absence of one. A gaping, black void where features should have been. Vivian screamed. The lights exploded, and the last thing she heard before she lost consciousness was the whisper of a voice. "He never let me leave." When she woke up, it was morning. Her door was locked. No scratches. No signs of what had happened. She rushed out of her room, found the steward, demanded to know if anyone had heard anything. He only shook his head. "No one was outside your room last night. Vivian left the ship at the next port." She never wrote about the celestial dawn, never told anyone what she had seen. But weeks later, as she unpacked her suitcase at home, she found something she knew she hadn't packed. A key, old, rusted, and attached to a tag that read, Cabin 604,